welcome to Not D&D. I am your host, Jessica, as always. And this week we have a returning guest. We have Gayla Dice back here to talk about her game, Psychodungeon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back on. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, this game sounded really cool and interesting, and I posted at the beginning of the month on EM World the article saying who we're having on Not D&D, and this got a few comments as well, people being like, okay, this sounds very interesting. So really glad to talk to you more about the game. But first, as always, I'm going to be nosy and dig into you and your life. You were previously on the show in January this year. We were talking about your game Terminal, which, again, if people haven't listened, go back and listen to that because that's an excellent game. But there we kind of did your history and background with tabletop RPGs. So instead, for this episode, as it's been almost a year, I was wondering if you could talk us through your 2024 in-game. So any gaming highlights or projects you've been working on and things like that.
Yeah, 2024 has been a very interesting year for me. I imagine next year will be very different, but I'll probably have learned a lot from it. At the time we were speaking in January, I think maybe just sort of made the decision of like having left my previous like employment. I was like, I'm not necessarily getting much bites on other jobs. I have a lot of disabilities that make working quite hard. I'm going to try and have this as my main focus for the year. So this is kind of what I've been doing all year. And that means it's been very exciting. You know, I finalized the release of Terminal at that time. I ran the Kickstarter for Psychodungeon. I have another campaign out currently for this, the end of the year. I've released some smaller games in that time. I've been to significantly more conventions than I was last year. And like a lot of that's been like very exciting. It's been very tiring. It's made everything related to, I guess, like ideas of success feel a bit more stressful than years gone past, where it was maybe more sort of enjoyed. And I think I've had to make a lot of like adjustments. I'm still probably making adjustments about like how I spend my time now that like this is my focus. So after Psychodungeon finished running, I ended up starting like going to a queer social at a board game cafe near me, like in my local area, and running games there a lot. And that's been really fun. It's been really nice to like connect with people in my area who share similar interests. And I think it's an interesting thing where I think I can see a shift happening maybe in my design. And I could see like there being like starting points of that in Psychodungeon. Mainly it's just like I think my design is always very in tune with however I am currently playing games. So Terminal was very much born out of the fact that I was playing with a regular group where we would be, running campaigns of different things longer, and that group ended up coming to an end. And now, because what I play is a lot more one-shots with people, that informed like the play of some of the zine books I put out this year. And I definitely think I can see it influencing ideas of how I do stuff going forward. But yeah, it's been a lot of stuff of trying to like be, I guess, in tune with the world. I think is like all the world of games, like trying to be in tune with like who's playing stuff, as well as then at conventions, like who's reading stuff, who's seeing stuff. There's been a lot of sort of like challenges to it, but yeah, I've enjoyed it. And as well, like getting to go to the queer social means I also don't always run things there. Sometimes I'm just playing things. So I've like ran a lot of my own stuff. I have used it for play testing as well, but also I've like played in games like For the Queen, which is actually the first time I played For the Queen, which was really exciting. I played like Spire for the first time, just running in someone else's game here. So like that's been something exciting, and I think it's something I want to try and do more of. I think I'm at a bit of a, I think this year has felt like a bit of a sort of crossroads. I think I tried to like make a lot, and I think I did make a lot, but also there's part of me that looks back and goes, next year I'm like, maybe slower.
Maybe
we'll
slow.
see,
Yeah,
we'll see how this
that's the
goes.
thing.
And so much of it is figuring out my own limits,
Yeah.
capabilities, but also like what's interested me. I think all of the games I've made this year have like always been very different from each other and from my previous things, while still connecting to the stuff that interests me, like how people relate to each other or fail to relate to each other, and how systems of relationship are informed by the context they're sort of forged in. Yeah, that's what I've been up to.
That sounds great. I mean, it's very exciting, like you say, becoming like a full-time publisher and doing games. I think a lot of people will be like, wow, that's my ideal dream job. As you mentioned, there are challenges and things with it. If somebody else was thinking about doing what you've done and maybe taking the leap and doing that, what would you have any advice or pearls of wisdom for them?
I think the complicated thing is, I guess you also need to think a bit about like where your own life is at and what it could be. Like, to some extent, this is a choice. To some extent, it was also a choice I made under like, what are my options? I guess there's just this. For me doing this, like a large amount of months survive on benefits, which is like a very, just not really a livable sort of situation. So for me, it's very sort of like close to the wire constantly, but also that's what my life would have been like anyway. So that was a somewhat easy decision for me to make, where it's like, well, ultimately I looked at the situations and the avenues that are available for me, and I'm like, probably whatever I do, I'm going to be living in poverty. I'm comfortable living in poverty and making great art at the same time.
Well, there we go. I mean, on that
like
note, I will say
that's maybe less like inspiring advice that I maybe wanted to. I guess like I do think there's so much stuff about figuring out your own time and how you spend your time, if you are doing that either for like sort of reasons of necessity or because it's, you know, very currently sort of successful. I think, yeah, thinking out how you spend your time, making sure you're not overworking yourself, because you are both your own boss and your own worker. So like if you get overwhelmed and freak out, like you did that to yourself, and that can make everything a bit more frustrating. So like, yeah, figuring out limits, figuring out where you spend your time. And also for me at least, definitely is a lot of making sure, like, because if you are doing full-time RPGs, I feel in like 99% of instances you're going to do that, you are going to work from home. And if you're someone like me who's a writer who often just writes by themselves, it also means like, you know, without conscious effort, I could go a long time without speaking to anyone. And I think it's important to not have that happen. I think it's also important to like stay inspired as well. Like if I'm thinking so much just about RPGs, it's like, okay, well, am I thinking about like, this is going to sound very pretentious. I was like, am I thinking about life? Or at least like, am I thinking about like things that interested me? Am I taking in other art? Because I could see how it could be very easy to become very insular.
Yeah, no. Someone works from home publishing RPGs. I agree. But yeah, definitely. But let's segue into talking about the fruits of your labor this year. So let's talk about PSYCHODUNGEON. So the game successfully funded on Kickstarter earlier this year. Backers have their rewards. So it's out in the world. So if people listening would like to pick up a copy, you absolutely can. So there's a link on the screen and in the show notes where you can pick up a copy of the book there. But Kayla, give us the introduction. So what is PSYCHODUNGEON?
So the cover pitch of PSYCHODUNGEON is a fantasy workplace action drama played with no dice and no masters. So it's a GM-less token-based game in the city of Glyndain, which is a sort of urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy setting, you know, mixing the modern and the magical. And, you know, it's a world of traffic jams, high-tech gizmos, and magic spells. In the setting when someone's troubles or traumas reach like a sort of breaking point, what springs from them is a psychodungeon, a mindscape structure reflecting all of their sort of like stressors and baggage. And when that happens, it's going to start like draining someone of all of their energy. So plumbers get called in to go in there with the client, clear it out of obstacles, help them come to an understanding, which isn't so much about gaining closure, it's about just pulling someone back from the brink. And that's what the root of play is in Psycho Dungeon. You are these psycho plumbers going in and out of people's dungeons. You're part adventurer, part handyman, part therapist.
All of those things. I mean, that's a fantastic setting. It's incredibly interesting and gripping, and I can already see the scope for telling so many interesting stories from it. What was your inspiration behind this?
It's interesting. I think the idea may have came to me, the setting plot idea of like magical realist setting, psycho plumbers, mind dungeons. I think that came to me all at once. I think I was on a plane back from Gen Con last year, and that idea came to me. I think it was probably, I guess if I was saying like what things inspired it, it was probably a fact of like I used to work as a teacher, which is a very sort of emotionally involved job that can feel like it's taking a lot of you. Yeah. I've been on the other side of a lot of counseling as someone who's been very mentally ill at different times of my life. Then a lot of my other family are like tradies as well. And I guess I was also thinking absently, because I think maybe The Wizard was the first playbook, and maybe at one point you were all going to just be like wizards, because there was this idea of like, why are wizard schools always played as like academic settings when all of the lessons shown kind of make it seem like a trade school? So I like the idea of like at least blue collar, working class characters. And yeah, it brought in a lot of my feelings about work, about different jobs I've done. And yeah, so then the other inspiration, I guess, in terms of like fiction, the setting and the fantasy, some stuff like Scott Pilgrim went into it, some things almost like Two Buddy. Like the list in the back of like different inspirations is very, very idiosyncratic. I think it does have an almost kind of like web comic energy, but almost it's a big like melting pot of fantasy and like sci-fi, and it's just using all of that to drive like emotional themes about how people are kind of worn down under capitalism.
Yeah. What a vibe. One thing I do want to mention as well is obviously I know you mentioned things like safety tools being important, because I guess in this game, if you're dealing with people's traumas and things like that, that could be such a wide variety of things. And I guess it's just making sure that the table if there's topics that the table does or does not want to deal with, because there's a lot of people around the world dealing with a lot of real life stuff that maybe in the game they don't want to and stuff. So I guess it's just being mindful of that. But one thing I wanted to ask is, because this is a GM-less system, normally the GM would take the lead in like making sure lines and veils are done, things like that. So how do you suggest people approach safety tools when there is a GM-less system and everybody's kind of, there's not one authority on the table, as it were?
Yeah, so Psycho Dungeon as a text is structured in a way where like it goes through the key elements of the book, like how the book works, how role-playing in this game works, how moves function, author playbooks, how a dungeon works, how a client works, because there's those 3 asymmetric roles. It goes through that in the order it's encountered, and that's like the sort of teaching the rules section. And then there is a separate section which is focused on facilitating the game, because there is an understanding, I think, from me with this book that like even in situations where something is GM-less, there is at least someone who has done like the thing of saying, I think we should play this game. Do you want to come round mine at this time? Oh, are we doing this online? What time are we meeting? I'll invite these people. And so the facilitating Psycho Dungeon section has a lot of advice both on teaching the game in general, which focuses on a lot of lessons I learned from education, where it's saying like, introduce this stuff now, feel free to introduce this stuff later. And within that, there's the fact that like, hey, if you're facilitating this game, you've got a bit more responsibility of bringing up certain things, or at the very least, you have the responsibility of delegating that responsibility. I think for Psycho Dungeon, so much it is about like fostering a good, or I mean, good's maybe, but like a play culture that works for this game, where you're talking a lot out of character in very honest ways about like what themes you're wanting to explore and how those themes are exploring you. And there should be an atmosphere of getting to check in a lot, especially because you're building an individual dungeon with different textures. It's one thing you've done your lines and veils in your very first session, and you cleared up everything you thought was relevant. And then in 3 sessions time, you're about to like go into a dungeon where the textures selected are medical trauma, gender dysphoria, and financial difficulties. And you're like, oh, we should go over this again. And the game is encouraging you to not consider those closed conversations.
Yeah, nice. So let's talk about the actual game and the system, because it's a token-based system. It's kind of influenced by the belonging. But as you mentioned, the book talks you through how to play. So where would you start? Should we structure our conversation that way?
So yeah, the starting of the book introduces a lot of the world in a very sort of like basic overview of like, hey, this is what you do. It then jumps into how you're setting up the game, where that's the individual, you build out your setting so you have an idea of it. Like it's a very unique setting in terms of like, oh, this is what the world is, but also I think it's shaded very broadly. In the book I clarify, like, I definitely wrote this as a fantasy analog of London. You could probably play it as a fantasy analog of a different major city, and that would not... There's not a map of Glyndain, but there is a bunch of key locations you might pick out that are important to your character. But yeah, in the... how the rules sort of work, there's the fact that there are 3 roles in Psycho Dungeon. There is any number of Psycho Plumbers, someone who will act as a client, who is always like essentially like a special guest star in a sitcom analogy, in that the client is whoever has been affected by this. The client is built as a whole table at the same time as the dungeon is built. And they're the play role, even though they have a lot less access to like powerful moves where they get to do stuff. They're the play role that has complete influence over the pacing of the game, because you're descending each floor of the dungeon as the client, understands a bit more about what they're seeing. And that's something that only that client player gets to say. Then the third role is the dungeon, where that's, the physical landscape. And just like the regular Psycho Plumber players, it has access to its own moves, where it has manipulative moves where it's trying to like poke at the emotions of the people in the dungeon. That gains it tokens, and then it can spend those tokens to be like, cool, monster, walls made of lava. And they're like, oh no, I'm out of tokens. Hey, your ex, there's a picture of your ex-girlfriend here. Does that make you sad? I think that makes you sad. It's like, oh yeah, it got me sad. It's like, sick, token, new monster. Those 3 roles, so that's the thing. Then the game is in some ways a bit agnostic about how you structure a setting or your own play group, but giving you a lot of advice on how to, make decisions about what you're structuring. So, there's a version of a game where everyone makes a Psycho Plumber, and then it's just in an individual session. You're like, oh, who wants to be the dungeon and the client this time? And that's swapped around as you are playing games. There's a version where maybe you have someone who is a static dungeon player, and like that plausibly might be someone who's also facilitating the game. That doesn't make them a GM figure, because they still, like I said, the client is still the person who gets all of the control over the game's pacing, but they've got a bit more of a sort of static role they understand there. There's also a version where like you have like one client, as many Psycho Plumbers, but those players are all just going to pick up and pass around the dungeon role between them. And those are different approaches to play that the game spells out, I think, quite clearly about like, this is how this role works. And then in the facilitating section, there's like, here's how you could pick that role, whether someone has it or whether loads of people always have it. Because I think it's something that like, can meet it. While it's different, it wants to try and meet you where your play preferences are. Like if you are someone who doesn't have much experience with GM-less stuff and is like, I feel much better if one player really like wasn't fully in charge but had a kind of defined role for us to all ask questions for, versus someone where it's like, no, I want to play the dungeon a bit, but I don't want to be doing that all the time. And then it's like, okay, actually for this kind of play group, rotating that around feels really appealing. I think a lot of the rules, while they're like very clear, they've got a bit of a sort of tool setting approach in that like you have these rules as a table, you all have responsibility for figuring out how you interpret them and what pieces of scaffolding are essentially going to at some point fade away versus stay there as less scaffolding and more just crutches, I suppose, in this situation.
I mean, this approach really felt really nice for groups that like are moving around and maybe not everyone's there every week or something. Because like in a traditional, like say D&D campaign, if somebody's missing a session, that could feel like, oh, you've missed out and not done things. Whereas in this, you could easily have new people coming in, other people going out and rotating the roles, and it would feel a lot more organic that way. And so I think this works really well. So if you don't have a set group that's meeting up every week, but you want to play every week, you absolutely can with different people. It felt like, and almost you could have it could still be in the same world, I guess, as well, because you could just have different players coming in and doing stuff.
Yeah, it's setting wise, it's very easy to just be like, oh, why is like Janie's character not here this week? And it's just like, oh, she's on a different job. We don't work together every week, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, we talked a bit about the token-based system, so you've talked on how that works. But if we go into a little bit more detail, why did you choose for this setting to use this system? What about it made it feel like the right fit?
It's interesting. At one point, I was trying to write it as a hack of a harder sort of dice-based system.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't for some reason click to me, even though I have done dice-based GM stuff before. I'm trying to remember, because I tried to like read back through some of my old notes and go like, when did I decide this was fully diceless? I feel like maybe I had this idea. I was a bit sort of, I'm trying to remember. I think maybe some of it was, I think actually, I remember the trajectory was I had the idea fully formed. I tried to write out some notes for it in a dice system, and it just didn't work. And I was just like, I don't think with the hack I wanted to do, I don't think it worked with my setting, or at least the way I wanted to approach writing. Like, I think at this point, maybe it was like the setting was going to have to be a bit harder in some places. There was also maybe going to be like way more like stringent fiction about what your like workplace had to look like. And I was just like, it started taking me in a direction where I wasn't excited about it. And then I think I was sitting on the idea. I had the premise of it, but I wasn't really sure what I could do with it. And while thinking about it again, I was like, well, what if it was BOB? Because I'd written some Belonging Outside Belonging games before. I wrote To Embrace a Swamp Creature, which was about like mentally ill swamp things in a deprived commuter town. I was like, oh, well, this would be different. It would be bringing a lot of action into a BOB space, which that totally does happen in lots of cases. But I was like, it wasn't like, it's often not the biggest focus of those games. And I started doing a lot more reading on like either rereading Belonging Outside Belonging games I liked a lot, or reading new ones that I thought like, oh, these look like they've got a bit of a sort of action thrust. Like, how are they handling this stuff? And there are a couple of changes in there. Like at one point, a dungeon was going to be made of like, you were going to make each individual dungeon from different setting elements, which had their own individual moves. And they weren't going to be about like an issue. They were going to be about like an element of how the dungeon works. Like, oh, this is the monstrous, or this is the eerie. And then I was like, I tried to start writing moves, and I was like, I don't have enough moves. I think the dungeon only has like this many moves total. And I was like, okay, the dungeon should be its own thing. But I think the way it evolved is really informed by so many other Belonging Outside Belonging games. Like, I adapted how I do a lot of rules explanation from my own game to Embrace a Swamp Creature, the way dungeon textures worked, drew a bit on Wander Home, the way moves and the dungeon's moveset worked, drew a lot from like Galactic 2E. And then there were even other things, like eventually this idea of like, oh, it's an asymmetric game where there are at least 3 different roles. That was partly influenced by, like, I wrote a game called Fear the Taste of Blood, which did that, and that was a hack of Anyone Can Wear the Mask by Jeff Stormer. And I remember the way that worked, I think sometimes like splitting a GM roll up in discrete parcels. I think it can make stuff very interesting, where it's like, no, your responsibility is just setting versus your responsibility is just these supporting characters. And I was excited about how that would come together and feel unique.
Absolutely. So to give us like a taste of what a game would like feel like, do you have some examples of play or some sort of stories that you've had when you've run games or been playtesting?
Yeah, I think when I run games of it, like I have, gone and ran games of it at like the Queer Social. Often when I've run games at that setting, because it is random people, I've always leaned towards the lighter thing. So there are certain like textures where it's like, well, we're just going to take these off. I'm not going to bring these up. But then other ones that can work in ways where like, oh, well, you can play this big and dramatic, or you can play it small. Like Parents is one where it's like, you can play Parents like really brutally if you wanted, if they're, being churned over by a dungeon. But at least in one, because we were just being a bit like, we weren't being entirely silly, but we were being lighter. So I think we just played it with there as like, oh yeah, I think like these parents had like really high expectations. And it's like, so it can be traumatizing, but also we're not having to necessarily do a trigger warning. Yeah. The way we played it out is always like, oh, an individual force focused on an individual texture. So yeah, for once we got into that setting of like, oh, this is the parents for, these are the high expectations. It's this idea of we're like, oh, it's probably like really narrow in lots of places because you feel a bit claustrophobic, was what our dungeon was coming up with. And then we were also going like, oh, but it's also, because we are actually passing this around, and we're like, okay, yeah, very narrow, but I also think it's really high ceilings. I think this is a really place where you feel cramped, but also small. And that was really fun to figure out how it was reflecting there. And I think I love about the game is how you get so much ownership over elements of the world when you choose to pick up a certain character. Like if you're someone who is playing the werewolf, you get like a really big influence on how like the entirety of that works. Like, yeah, because I created a werewolf character, and I was saying like, okay, yeah, so they like, all we have as the detail is they got it in the dungeon. What do we necessarily think that looked like? Because another people may be like, oh yeah, probably got attacked by a werewolf in the dungeon. But I was like, no, I think in the backstory I created for my character, I was like, yeah, I think she like was like, her and a client got like stuck in a dungeon for like days, and then when they both came out, they were like, oh, you're a werewolf. And they're like, oh no, you're a werewolf as well.
Amazing. So you have, we mentioned briefly some of the psycho plumbers you can play and some of the roles, like you mentioned kind of the werewolf and the wizard. What other, roles can we take when we play the game?
Yeah, so the 7 big roles start out, we have the wizard, which I've had described as degree regret. The playbook, it's a lot about like the idea of like, yeah, you've got to have like a real qualification from a vocational school to be a wizard. You invested a lot of time in that, and the playbook is really about what if you did all that and then are like, I don't know if I like this enough.
What a relatable playbook. So many people.
The witch then is about like witchcraft as this like private passion, and then the fact of like, oh well, that's been traded away to be work. It's essentially an act of having monetized a hobby and being like, has that affected the relationship with this hobby?
Gosh, who would do that?
With like the werewolf, I wrote the werewolf without necessarily realizing what it was about. Originally, I think I was thinking like that's probably about loss of control. Then I wrote it and read back the playbook, and I was like, no, this is about chronic pain. This is about like finding a relationship with your body and the pain it's in and its desires being a bit externalized away from you. And you know, developing as that playbook is trying to kind of like be a bit more unified with your body while also understanding it wants things that sometimes aren't like good for you in that way. It was a complete accident. I don't know if I'd have gone in being like, I'm going to write a chronic pain metaphor. No, like the cyborg as well then, which is, just like an old school style cyborg. They bring in a bit of like chronic fatigue in terms of they're so much about like balanced energy. Then from there, I might be missing some. Oh, Shapeshifter was all about like destroyed work-life balance. You know, it's this idea of like, what does the dungeon cost you as some of your establishing questions. It's actually like it's a big pick list, and then it's like choose 2 the dungeon cost you and 1 that chose to leave you, because it's like you're also a bit accountable for this destroyed balance, and that can be stuff like a relationship, or it could be like a drinking spot, or like something a bit more abstract. Then our final 2 are sword fighter and rock star. And sword fighter is all about like optimistic and being like, yeah, I'm just gonna go get him essentially. Whereas the rock star is all about performance. And it's essentially the rock star wasn't like came from me because it was me thinking the fact that anytime I was a teacher, I was putting on a mask. And that was also true when I've done other jobs like stand up or wrestling or even customer service. Like there is a putting on of a mask. And with the Rockstar playbook, it's like, this is someone who's consciously aware of that and playing with it.
Beautiful. I love all those different kind of options and the ways you can twist and take them with those characters, which is it's really nice. One thing I do want to touch upon is the actual artwork and art direction, because we'll just talk us through your choices and your intentions with the way the book looks visually, because it's very beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, the cover is the really beautiful illustration by Jeff Kaczynski. I just grabbed my copy to make sure I was pronouncing the last name right. I love that. Like that, it was absolutely awesome working with Jess, and I think she really captured like the vibe of this. And then for the interior art, it was all by me using collages done with photographs and often like mashing up either stock photos or photos I took, which was like a fun way of getting to like mash up elements of the real world and a fantasy world in a way that like conveyed a lot of like key stuff of the game. I think like, you know, I think the image of the wizard being an electrician in a wizard's hat with a staff like sells a lot about like what this world looks like. The fact that like the werewolf is it's a girl with like dog features in like a supermarket, it tells us that. And then as well as that, we get other images which maybe peek at the weird sort of like dreamscape-esque way that the literal psycho dungeons work and appear. And then we also get just some fun stuff that's like getting to take a stock image and turning into like, okay, what if this was a cyborg and a wizard hanging out?
Why not? So we talked about the game a bit, like being obviously it is GM-less, but you have the option of having somebody be kind of like the lead by maybe staying in the role of the dungeon for a while. If this is somebody's first time trying out a GM-less game, do you have any general kind of advice or tips for them if they're more used to a more traditional kind of structured RPG?
I'd say like just be patient with yourself is a big first thing. I think like, you know, sometimes you're going to be like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right. And if you're a whole table who are a bit less experienced with that, there's not necessarily going to be someone who's there to say, no, you're good. Playing with someone who's experienced can be also very useful for the fact that like you're probably not doing as much things like wrong or whatever as you feel you're just a bit insecure, and having someone like probably the first time you ever role play full stop going like, no, what you just did there was good is useful. In terms of like how you engage with the thing, I think referring back to your moves, I think, is always a big one. Either in terms of like, if you're stuck with like, what are we doing in the scene? How are we dealing with this problem? It's like, well, what are your moves that you do? Because you can always do any of your weak moves just because, and then that itself will spiral out some more interesting responses from there. Yeah, I'd say like focus on that. And otherwise, this is a game definitely that like wants you to create very interesting characters. That's why kind of like all of the playbooks are thrusted towards like narrative concerns or personal concerns. And I think then it's just a case of being honest with everyone around there about like what's kind of stuff you want to see. If you feel like you've just had a fight scene and you're like, yeah, I felt like I enjoyed that. But also I maybe want something a bit more like, I don't know, talky now. Just be honest in terms of like, hey, I want my character to have a bit of a freak out about the thing they saw in the gender dysphoria floor of the dungeon. Who would like to do this scene with me? Yeah, I think a big thing for GM-less stuff compared to other style is often you do pull a bit of like you kind of, I guess, sometimes read the stage directions out loud if you're borrowing a sort of theater thing, and like that can feel like you're doing things wrong, but it's fine. And it's I think it's really okay to just be like, yes, sometimes play involves stepping in and out of the position of player, so you know you're enjoying yourself.
Fab. I love that. Thank you so much for talking through the game and sharing it with us. If any of this has seemed interesting to anybody, you can pick up the physical book at ratwave.square.site. Links on the screen and in the show notes, because the best way to support indie tabletop RPG creators is to buy their stuff. And the digital version is also available on itch as well, and the links are there too. So at the beginning of the stream, the Trauma the Dungeon got to me, the stream, we talked about kind of your past 2024 and what that year has been. What are your upcoming plans? So obviously PsychoDungeon is written, it's made, it's out there in the world, so we're talking about it. What's coming next for you?
Yeah, actually, if you are in London a week from now, on November 30th, I'll be at Dragonmeet Robbie. So that's another place you could buy PsychoDungeon physically, because I'll be there in the Upper Trade Hall selling physical books. In terms of, also at the moment in time, I'm currently running a backer kit for a 2-player card-based action game called Transgender Deathmatch Legend 2, which has been, it's been a sort of slow thing getting the word out, but like that has now funded. Hopefully in these last couple of days, we maybe manage to get some stretch goals, but if we don't, that's okay, that game's there. I think for me next year, I'm going to be like refiguring out a lot about my practice. I think to some extent, I maybe want to slow down and take a bit more time with this stuff. I think I'm really proud of PsychoDungeon, but also I definitely feel there are times that I had to rush from getting it out to getting ready to start selling Transgender Deathmatch Legend 2. And part of me is like, would I have been able to enjoy it more if I got to live with like, I got this game out? That's the thing that happens, rather than like, I'm always on to the next thing. And, you know, it's money concerns there. So next year, I'm plausibly going to be like trying to find different sort of experiments of maybe how I can make more stuff. And I want to spend a bit more time with my projects if that is possible. So an idea I've been tinkering with, which will definitely see some form of life next year. Like I think I'd like to maybe try putting out some like ash cans and running some more like public playtests as opposed to just my private ones. It's a game I'm not ready to publicly reveal the actual name of it yet, though I do have a working title I'm on. But it is currently in a lot of my working documents as Untitled Kayla Dice Sci-Fi Noir game. It's going to be, a noirish criminal thriller set on a retro-futuristic space station. And so, drawing a lot from noir, drawing a lot from stories of morally complex characters in seedy criminal situations.
Fantastic. Well, tell you what, when it has a name and is out and available, why don't you come back and tell us more about it then?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Perfect. So before you go as well, the question I always ask people is, do you have any recommendations for any other indie tabletop RPGs? And the rules are it can't be D&D, obviously, because this is not D&D, and it can't be a game that you've made.
Yeah. So I talked about how I'd been running a lot of games at the queer social I go to. One of the first games I ran there earlier this year was a game called Witch of the Westmoreland by Laurie O'Connell, which was a hack of the original Royal Blood, the game already kickstarting like the new release of, or have just finished kickstarting the new release of, I should say. But it's really interesting about your knights. You are companions of an injured knight, and you have to take the injured knight to the Witch of the Westmoreland to, who is the only person who can heal them. And I had a really fun game where our cast of characters was like the knight squire, who was sort of like thinking of like, who's like, I'm good enough at this. The knight's like familiar, who was like a talking squirrel who had eaten a magic acorn that the knight had, and then like the knight's liege, who was like their former liege's like fail son, and like we had a Arthurian nepo baby as one of our leads. It was a very fun session, and I think like the game Witch of the Westmoreland and the way it works is really cool. And yeah, that's by Laurie O'Connell. You can find his work at 12 Pins Press if you wanted to get your own copy of that.
Perfect. I love that recommendation. Thank you so much. Kayla, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about Psychodungeon. As mentioned, it is out and available now, so if people are interested, just click the link and you can pick up a copy for yourself. And I look forward to having you back on to talk about unnamed space noir TTRPG next year, maybe at some point.
Yeah, I hope so. And thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
As always. And thank you to everyone who watched and listened. We'll be back next week with another indie tabletop RPG to introduce to you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Right.